Marcus Blackwood stood frozen in the doorway of his marble kitchen, his $3,000 Italian shoes silent against the cold floor. There, on the granite island, where only business contracts usually lay, sat a single white candle flickering in the darkness. A small vanilla cupcake waited beneath the dancing flame, and beside it, a handwritten note in elegant cursive. "Happy 42nd birthday, Mr. Blackwood." His hands trembled as he recognized the handwriting of Elena Reyes, his head of household staff, the one person who knew exactly why he'd forbidden birthdays in his empire for the past 15 years. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories about powerful people discovering what truly matters in life, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. The flame wavered as Marcus's breath caught in his throat. 15 years. 15 years since he'd last seen a birthday candle, since he'd last allowed anyone to acknowledge the day that had once brought him so much joy and had ultimately destroyed everything he held dear. Elena knew this. She knew about the accident, about Sarah, about the promise he'd made to never celebrate again. Yet here she was, defying his most sacred rule with nothing but a cupcake and a candle that probably cost less than his morning coffee. Marcus Blackwood wasn't just wealthy, he was fortress rich, the kind of man whose net worth fluctuated by millions while he slept. At 42, he commanded a business empire spanning 3 continents, owned properties in 12 countries, and could buy small nations if the mood struck him. But wealth, he'd learned the hardest way possible, couldn't purchase the one thing he'd lost on his 27th birthday. His daughter Sarah, who'd been killed in a car accident while rushing to get to his surprise party. The memory hit him like ice water. Sarah's bright 7-year-old face, her excitement as she'd helped his ex-wife plan the surprise, her insistence that they had to have the biggest chocolate cake in the world because Daddy worked so hard. She'd been in that car. Because of him, because of a birthday he didn't even want to celebrate. The drunk driver who'd run the red light had stolen more than Sarah's life. He'd murdered every ounce of joy Marcus had ever associated with celebrations, gifts, or acknowledgement of the passage of time. No birthdays, he'd told every assistant, every staff member, every business partner for 15 years. No cards, no cakes, no acknowledgements. Treat it like any other day. It became as ironclad as his business contracts. Employees who forgot faced immediate termination. Friends who dared mention it found themselves permanently excluded from his circle. Even his own mother had learned to stay silent each October 15th, understanding that her son had buried his capacity for celebration alongside his daughter. But Elena Reyes had never been like other employees. She'd arrived 18 months ago through an elite domestic staffing agency, carrying impeccable references and an almost unsettling ability to anticipate his needs. At 34, Elena possessed the rare combination of professional competence and natural grace that made her indispensable to a man whose standards had driven away dozens of staff members. She was strikingly beautiful in a way that was impossible to ignore. Warm brown eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed walls, dark hair that caught light like silk, and a smile that could disarm world leaders, though she rarely bestowed it upon him. More importantly, Elena ran his household like a conductor leading a symphony. She coordinated his 3 personal chefs, managed his security team, oversaw maintenance of his 7-bedroom Manhattan penthouse, and somehow made his life function seamlessly while remaining nearly invisible. She spoke 4 languages fluently, held a master's degree in hospitality management, and could organize a dinner party for 30 world leaders with 3 hours' notice. She was exactly the kind of professional he needed and respected. What he hadn't expected was how she'd begin to matter. It started with small things. The way she'd leave his morning coffee at exactly the temperature he preferred without being asked. How she'd stock his favorite books in every room he frequented. The subtle way she'd reschedule his evening meetings when she noticed he was pushing himself too hard, creating pockets of rest he didn't know he needed. Elena never overstepped, never presumed familiarity, never tried to be anything other than exceptional at her job. Except she watched him. He'd caught her sometimes, those intelligent eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Not the calculating stare of someone planning to leverage his wealth or position, but something deeper. Something that felt dangerously like understanding. "You work too much, Mr. Blackwood," she'd said one evening 6 months ago, standing in his study doorway with his dinner. It was past midnight, and he'd been reviewing acquisition contracts for 14 hours straight. "I work exactly as much as necessary," he'd replied without looking up. "Necessary for what?" The question was gentle but piercing. "You have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. Your companies run themselves with the excellent people you've hired. What are you working toward?" He'd finally looked up then, ready to deliver the cold dismissal that kept people at appropriate distances. But Elena's expression held no judgment, no agenda. Just genuine curiosity, as if she truly wanted to understand what drove him to build walls out of 18-hour workdays and endless acquisition deals. I work to avoid thinking, he'd answered, surprising himself with his honesty. She'd nodded, as if this made perfect sense. I understand. But maybe some thoughts are worth having. Then she'd placed his dinner on the side table and left without another word, leaving him staring at the empty doorway and wondering when his household manager had become someone whose opinion actually mattered to him. Now, standing in his kitchen at 11:47 p.m. on October 15th, Marcus realized Elena had been building toward this moment for months. Every conversation, every gentle observation, every way she'd somehow made his sterile penthouse feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home, it had all been leading to this single candle. The cupcake was perfect, professionally made, but somehow personal. The candle was plain white, nothing fancy or presumptuous. But the note? God, the note. Her handwriting was elegant but warm, the kind that suggested she'd taken time to make it beautiful. She'd used his first name, something no employee had dared do in years. Marcus walked slowly to the island, his reflection multiplied endlessly in the wall of windows overlooking the city. 42 floors below, Manhattan pulsed with life. Millions of people celebrating, mourning, existing in ways he'd forgotten how to do. Up here, in his climate-controlled sanctuary, time had stopped 15 years ago, in a hospital waiting room where a doctor had spoken words that changed everything. Picked up the note. Elena's careful script sending an unexpected warmth through his chest. How had she known? His birthday wasn't on any employment records, wasn't marked in any company calendars. He'd made sure of that, scrubbed it from every database, every reference. But Elena knew things about him that others didn't, had been quietly collecting pieces of information with the patience of an archaeologist reconstructing ancient civilizations. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows across the marble countertops. Such a small flame, but it seemed to push back 15 years of carefully constructed darkness. Marcus found himself remembering not the accident, but the birthdays before. Sarah at 3, face covered in chocolate cake, singing off-key. Sarah. At 5, insisting on making him a crown out of construction paper. Sarah at 6, explaining very seriously that 7 candles were too many and would cause a fire, so they should use only 2. The memories didn't hurt the way he'd expected them to. Instead, they felt like finding photographs he'd thought were lost forever, faded, but precious, worth preserving rather than burying. Mr. Blackwood? Elena's voice came from behind him, soft and cautious. He turned to find her standing in the kitchen entrance, no longer in her usual professional attire. Instead, she wore jeans and a simple cream sweater, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger, more vulnerable, and Marcus realized he'd never seen her like this, as Elena the person, rather than Elena the employee. "You're supposed to be off duty," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "I know." She stepped into the kitchen, moving with the careful grace of someone approaching a wounded animal. "I was leaving when I realized I'd done something I might get fired for." "The candle?" She nodded, her hands clasped in front of her. "I overstepped. I know your rules about birthdays, and I broke them. Deliberately." Marcus studied her face in the candlelight. "How did you know?" "Your mother called 3 months ago. She was crying." Elena's voice was gentle, careful. She hung up quickly when I answered, but not before she said something about wishing she could call her son on his birthday. I did some research after that, found old newspaper articles about the accident, about Sarah. The mention of his daughter's name should have triggered the familiar ice-cold rage that had protected him for 15 years. Instead, Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, not painful but profound, like ice breaking after a long winter. "I'm not asking you to talk about it," Elena continued. "I'm not trying to fix you or save you or any of the things people usually attempt. I thought maybe someone should acknowledge that you've survived another year, that you've built something meaningful with your life, even while carrying that loss. That, maybe, even though you don't want to celebrate, someone should say that the world is better because you're in it." Marcus gripped the edge of the marble island, his knuckles white. "You don't know what you're talking about." "You're right," Elena agreed quietly. "I don't know what it's like to lose a child. I can't imagine that kind of pain. But I do know what it's like to watch someone disappear inside their own life, to build walls so high they can't see the sky anymore. These walls keep me functional." "Do they?" The question was gentle but relentless. "Or do they keep you from living?" Marcus wanted to fire her, should fire her. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was exactly the kind of boundary violation that required immediate termination. Elena had researched his personal tragedy, contacted outside sources, made unilateral decisions about how to handle his most painful memories. She'd committed fireable offenses that should have security escorting her from the building by dawn. But he couldn't stop looking at the candle. Sarah would have been 22 next month, he heard himself say. She wanted to be a teacher. He used to line up her stuffed animals and teach them math. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak, somehow understanding that words would shatter this fragile moment. She made me cards for every birthday. Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Handmade things with glitter and crooked letters. I kept them all in my desk at the office. After the accident, I threw them away. I was so angry at God, at the world, at myself for letting her get in that car. I threw away everything that reminded me of celebration. The candle burned steadier now, as if drawing strength from his words. The last thing she said to me was, "Happy birthday, Daddy. I love you to the moon and back." She was texting me from the car, probably when she should have been wearing her seatbelt. Marcus's voice broke. For 15 years, I've believed that loving me killed her. Elena moved closer, not touching, but present, her warmth cutting through the coldness that had become his default state. Love didn't kill her. A drunk driver killed her. Love is what made her excited about your birthday. Love is what made her want to celebrate you. I can't. The words came out raw, desperate. I can't celebrate when she's gone. I'm not asking you to celebrate, Elena said softly. I'm asking you to remember. There's a difference between celebrating and honoring. You can honor the love she had for you without betraying her memory. Marcus stared at the small flame, seeing not just a candle, but a bridge between the man he'd been and the man he'd forgotten he could become. For 15 years, he'd preserved Sarah's memory by refusing joy, as if happiness would somehow diminish her importance in his life. But Elena was right. Sarah had loved his birthdays not because of cake or presents, but because they were days specifically devoted to celebrating the man who meant everything to her. She used to wake up at 5 a.m. on my birthday, he said, a small smile ghosting across his lips. Couldn't contain her excitement, would bounce on the bed until I got up, then drag me to the kitchen where she'd help make breakfast. Usually burned everything. She sounds wonderful. She was chaos, in a 7-year-old package. Smart as hell, stubborn as her father, and completely convinced she could fix any problem with hugs and chocolate chips. The memories came easier now, 15 years of suppressed love flowing like water through a broken dam. She was going to change the world, you know? Had it all planned out. First grade, then teacher college. Then she was going to teach every kid in America to read. Elena smiled through her tears. She did change the world. She changed yours. The truth of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah had changed his world, not just through her death, but through her life. Every successful business decision, every calculated risk, every empire-building move had been motivated not by greed, but by the desire to honor the little girl who'd believed her daddy could do anything. He'd built monuments to her memory in steel and glass, had created jobs for thousands, had donated millions to children's charities, all in Sarah's name, though he'd never admitted it to anyone, including himself. I've been so afraid of forgetting her that I forgot how to live with loving her, he whispered. Elena reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was warm, real, alive in a way that made him realize how cold he'd been for so long. You don't have to choose between missing her and moving forward. You can do both. Marcus looked down at their joined hands, then back at the candle. The flame hadn't wavered, hadn't gone out despite all the words that had passed over it. Like love, he realized. Like the connection between him and Sarah that death couldn't actually sever, only transform. Will you stay? The words escaped before he could stop them, vulnerable and needy in a way that terrified him. While I blow out the candle? Of course. Marcus leaned forward, the warmth of the flame touching his face. He closed his eyes and made a wish, not for Sarah to come back, because that was impossible, but for the strength to carry her love forward instead of burying it beneath layers of guilt, in isolation. Then he blew gently, and the light went out. But the darkness wasn't the same as before. Elena's presence beside him, the lingering scent of vanilla, the taste of memory on his tongue. Somehow, the absence of light felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. "Thank you," he said to the darkness, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in 15 years. "Happy birthday, Marcus," Elena replied, and for the first time since Sarah's death, those words didn't feel like betrayal. They felt like coming home. They stood in the darkness for a long time, neither speaking, both understanding that something fundamental had shifted in the space between Marcus's walls. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless pulse, but inside, this kitchen, time had started moving again for a man who'd been frozen in grief for far too long. When Elena finally squeezed his hand and whispered goodnight, Marcus didn't watch her leave. Instead, he remained by the island, breathing in the lingering scent of vanilla and possibility, finally ready to face the truth he'd been avoiding for 15 years. Sarah's love hadn't died with her. It had been waiting patiently for him to Remember that loving someone meant carrying them forward, not burying them in the past. Tomorrow, he decided, he would call his mother. He would visit Sarah's grave for the first time since the funeral. He would do what his daughter would have wanted. He would start living again, not despite her death, but because of the love they'd shared. And maybe, just maybe, he would allow Elena to light another candle next year, not to celebrate the passage of time, but to honor the love that makes time meaningful. The kitchen fell silent except for the distant hum of the city below, but Marcus no longer felt alone. For the first time in 15 years, his birthday had brought him not pain, but the possibility of peace. And somewhere in the darkness, he could almost hear a 7-year-old voice whispering, "I love you to the moon and back, Daddy. Happy birthday." Marcus remained in the kitchen long after Elena had gone, his mind replaying not just their conversation, but months of small moments he'd previously dismissed. The way Elena had subtly rearranged his schedule after particularly brutal board meetings, creating space for him to decompress. How she'd started stocking the pantry with Sarah's favorite cookies, chocolate chip with sea salt, without explanation, just leaving them where he'd noticed during his late-night work sessions. The gentle way she'd begun playing classical music. In the common areas, the same pieces he used to hum while reading Sarah bedtime stories. Elena hadn't just been managing his household, he realized. She'd been carefully, patiently weaving reminders of joy back into his carefully sterile existence. Every small change had been calculated to heal rather than harm, to honor rather than replace. She'd seen through his walls to the father buried beneath the businessman, and she'd decided he was worth saving. The realization should have felt like an invasion of privacy. Instead, it felt like being seen for the first time in 15 years. As dawn approached, Marcus found himself walking through his penthouse with new eyes. The gleaming surfaces and minimalist design that had once felt sophisticated now seemed cold, empty. When had he stopped hanging pictures? When had he removed every trace of the life he'd lived before? The penthouse was a monument to successful isolation, a shrine to a man who'd convinced himself that feeling nothing was safer than risking everything. But Elena had quietly been changing that too. Fresh flowers appeared weekly in crystal vases, not elaborate arrangements that demanded attention, but simple bouquets that brought life into sterile spaces. Books appeared on side tables, not the dry business journals he usually favored, but novels, poetry, biographies of people who'd overcome impossible odds. She'd been feeding his soul while he focused on starving it. Marcus paused in his study, the same room where Elena had asked him what he was working toward 6 months ago. On his desk, beneath a stack of contracts, he noticed something he'd somehow missed. A small framed photograph that hadn't been there the day before. His hands shook as he moved the papers aside and picked it up. It was a picture of Sarah at 6 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing the construction paper crown she'd made for his 36th birthday. Her small hands held a cardboard sword, and she was striking a fierce pose as Princess Sarah, protector of daddies. Birthday! He'd thought all these photos were gone, destroyed in his grief-fueled purge 15 years ago. A note was tucked behind the frame in Elena's careful handwriting. Found this in a box your mother dropped off 6 months ago. She said Sarah would want you to remember that being a king requires remembering what you're protecting. Marcus sank into his leather chair, clutching the photograph. His mother. Of course. She'd been quietly coordinating with Elena, two women who loved him enough, to risk his anger in service of his healing. They'd been planning this moment for months, maybe longer, creating a network of care around a man who'd made it clear he wanted to be left alone with his pain. The photograph brought back memories he'd forgotten he had. Sarah's elaborate birthday. Plans, how she'd spend weeks preparing surprises that usually involved glitter, finger paints, and catastrophic kitchen experiments. She'd taken his birthdays more seriously than Christmas, treating them like national holidays that required proper celebration. Daddy worked so hard, she'd tell anyone who would listen. He deserves the biggest party in the world. But it wasn't just the parties Sarah had cared about. She loved the quiet moments too, sitting in his lap while he read her stories, helping him tie his ties in the morning, falling asleep on his chest during weekend movie marathons. She'd been his shadow, his cheerleader, his reminder that he was more than just another man in an expensive suit. To Sarah, he'd been a superhero whose superpower was being her father. Marcus opened his laptop and, for the first time in 15 years, typed Sarah's name into a search engine. The results were painful, but necessary. Obituaries, accident reports, news coverage of a tragic collision that had stolen a bright little girl from the world. But there were other things too, things he'd forgotten. The scholarship fund established, in Sarah's name at her elementary school. The children's reading program his company had funded without his conscious approval, administered by someone who'd clearly been paying attention to his daughter's dreams even after her death. Elena's influence again, he realized. She'd been finding ways to honor Sarah's memory that didn't require him to confront his grief directly. The donations, the programs, the quiet, charitable work that had somehow kept his daughter's spirit alive in the world even while he'd been trying to bury it. Elena had understood what he hadn't, that Sarah's death meant her love needed to grow bigger, not smaller. The sun was rising over Manhattan, painting his penthouse in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of Sarah's hair. Marcus made a decision that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. "Mom?" His voice cracked on the single word. Silence on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Marcus? Oh, sweetheart, is everything okay?" "I got your picture," he said, looking down at Sarah's grinning face. The one of her in the crown. His mother started crying immediately, 15 years of suppressed maternal grief pouring through the phone. "I've been wanting to give that to you for so long, but I was afraid. I was so afraid you'd hate me for it." "I could never hate you, Mom. I've been the one who's been..." Marcus struggled for words. "I've been the one who's been wrong. About everything." "Oh, my darling boy." His mother's voice was thick with tears and love. "You haven't been wrong. You've been hurt. There's a difference." They talked for 2 hours, sharing memories of Sarah that Marcus had locked away for 15 years. His mother told him about the dream she still had about her granddaughter, about the birthday cards she wrote to Sarah every year but never sent, about the toys she still bought at Christmas for a little girl who would never grow up. Marcus told her about Elena, about the candle, about the realization that honoring Sarah meant living with her love rather than dying with her death. "She sounds like a remarkable woman, this Elena," his mother said near the end of their conversation. "I'd like to meet her properly. Maybe we could have dinner sometime, all 3 of us." The suggestion should have sent Marcus into panic mode. He didn't do dinners, didn't do social gatherings, didn't do anything that resembled the family meals he'd once shared with Sarah. But the idea of Elena and his mother together, sharing stories and probably conspiring to heal him further, didn't feel threatening. It felt like coming alive. "I'd like that," he said, meaning it. After hanging up, Marcus sat in his study, watching Manhattan wake up below him. Millions of people beginning their days, facing their own struggles and celebrations, carrying their own losses and loves. For 15 years, he'd felt separate from all of it, isolated by wealth and grief, in his tower above the world. But Elena had reminded him of something Sarah had always known, that being human meant being connected, that love multiplied when shared rather than diminished. At exactly 9 a.m., Elena knocked on his study door, professional and composed in her usual dark suit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. But Marcus could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the worry that she'd pushed too far and was about to face the consequences. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully. "I have your schedule for today, and there are several matters that require your immediate attention." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, this extraordinary woman who'd somehow seen through his defenses to the man he'd forgotten he could be. "Elena," he said quietly, "would you have dinner with me and my mother this Sunday? Nothing fancy, nothing formal, just dinner." The professional mask slipped from Elena's face, revealing surprise, hope, and something that looked dangerously like joy. "I would be honored, Mr. Blackwood." "Marcus," he corrected gently. "I think it's time you called me Marcus." Elena smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her in 18 months of impeccable service, and Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Not the crack of breaking, but the warmth of healing. Sarah's love hadn't died with her. It had been waiting patiently for him to remember that the greatest gift he could give his daughter's memory was to keep living in a way that honored everything she'd taught him about love, joy, and the courage to celebrate another day of being alive. The candle was long since extinguished, but its light continued to burn in the space between them, promising that some endings are actually beginnings, and that love, real love, never really dies. It just waits for us to become brave enough to carry it forward.